Are the BRICS really trying to dethrone the dollar, create a currency backed by gold, and cause massive hyperinflation in the US? No. That's a bunch of sensationalist doomsday BS, and if you follow my channel, you know I don't waste your time with stuff like that. So today we're gonna dive into the 3 things the BRICS are actually trying to accomplish and how realistic those are.
The spotlight was on Johannesburg as South Africa hosted the BRICS summit.
A group of countries with fast-growing economies.
The US dollar is facing a backlash. The forefront of this is BRICS.
Just to make sure we're all on the same page, the BRICS is a group of countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that was formed in 2010 when South Africa was added to the former BRIC. In 2023, they added 6 more countries. I'm not sure if they're gonna try to come up with a new acronym that incorporates the new letters, but my suggestion is IU SCARI BEES. I don't know, what do you think? Think they'll go for that? Okay, the 3 things the BRICS are actually trying to accomplish are: number 1, challenge the Western-led world order. That's mostly China and Russia's motivation. Number 2, get access to cheap capital. That's the main motivation for the new countries that just joined. And number 3, reduce dollar hegemony. But how realistic are these? Let's start with China and Russia's main motivation, challenging the Western-led world order. As I'm sure you know, China and Russia are communist countries. Communism and democracy have a bit of a rivalry going on. Wars have been fought over this. China in particular resents that the West has historically tried to nudge it toward democracy and other Western values like freedom of speech. They're not the only country with these gripes by any means, but they're the ones with the most power and the closest economic ties to the Western world. But there's just one problem. Unlike the rival G7, which is made up of the US, UK, Canada, Germany, Italy, France, and Japan, the BRICS do not share any common values. Not all of them are communist. Not all of them are anti-West. Not all of them are in it for the same reasons. And it's for these reasons that they're unlikely to be able to unite and create an alternative world order. You see, it's the uniting part that will be the biggest challenge. They don't have common motivations or common objectives, and a lot of them hate each other. For example, the 2 biggest members, China and India, have an ongoing border dispute that resulted in over 20 deaths a couple years ago. India also banned most of the Chinese apps and just blocked a Chinese investment into an electric vehicle company. This is just one example, but a lot of the BRICS countries are not allies and are not likely to unite against the Western powers that, quite frankly, many of them rely on more and have better relationships with than the other BRICS countries. The second motivation for joining the BRICS is to get access to cheap capital. The BRICS have a bank called the New Development Bank. In case there's any confusion, it's not a central bank that could create a common currency. It's a development bank, which provides infrastructure funding to poor areas similar to the World Bank. A lot of the new members of the BRICS are in, shall we say, shaky financial positions, and their main motivation for joining was the hope that they could get access to cheap Chinese funding for their infrastructure. But let's think about this for a second. The New Development Bank's money comes from the BRICS' larger and wealthier members, aka China. Is China all of a sudden going to want to fund the unsustainable debts of countries like Argentina and Ethiopia? Probably not. And they have their own economic and debt issues that they're trying to deal with right now. Unfortunately, BRICS membership is not going to save these countries from their debt problems. The third motivation for the BRICS is to reduce dollar hegemony. And what that really means is to create an alternative system that would block the West from being able to cut them off from the global financial system. That's basically what happened to Russia in 2022, and countries that see themselves as potential enemies of the US want to make sure that doesn't happen to them one day. In order to understand whether they'll be able to create an alternative system, you have to understand the basics of what they're trying to replace and what's been tried so far. The West controls the 2 main systems that allow money to flow around the world: SWIFT and CHIPS. SWIFT is basically the language that almost all the banks around the world use to communicate with each other when processing transactions. It's based in Brussels and largely controlled by the US and the EU. CHIPS is a US-based system that clears about $1.8 trillion of transactions daily, and in order to use it, you have to go through a US bank or bank branch. Nearly every single dollar-based transaction in the world relies on either SWIFT or CHIPS or both. Being cut off from these systems is the financial equivalent of disaster. It's completely devastating, and since 2001, the US and their Western allies have become more and more willing to use this weapon to varying degrees, mostly against sponsors of terrorism and most notably against Iran and Russia. For years, adversaries of the US have been trying to come up with alternatives to these systems to protect themselves from the risk that they'll one day be cut off. In 2014, Russia was sanctioned after they invaded Crimea, so they came up with a SWIFT alternative called SPFS. But 9 years later, it's still barely used for any international trade. In 2015, China came up with a CHIPS alternative called CIPS. to settle and clear transactions in yuan. But it hasn't really caught on, and 80% of its transactions rely on SWIFT. The problem is that China's extremely tight capital controls, which place strict limits on how much money can be converted from yuan to other currencies, make it incredibly unattractive as a reserve currency. There are strict capital controls in nearly every BRICS country, so it's really not that easy for other countries to settle trades in rupees, rubles, yuan, or any of the others. That's why, even though the technology already exists, it's simply not realistic to think that they'll be able to start settling all their trades in any of the currencies of the BRICS countries. It's even less realistic for them to create a common currency for the same reason. China and many of the other BRICS countries will never give up their monetary sovereignty, aka their control over their own monetary policy. It's just never gonna happen. So that begs the question, can these countries do a little bit more trade in currencies other than the dollar over time? Sure, but can they dethrone the dollar as the world's reserve currency? No, not now. Not in 20 years, not in 100 years. The BRICS is barely even a real alliance. None of the objectives I mentioned applies to every member, and if they don't agree on anything or unite to utilize their collective strength, they're never gonna accomplish anything. Stop worrying about the BRICS and move on with your day. By the way, check out my free investing training in the first comment below and in the description. Thanks for watching.